Well, I'm here. We're building a bridge, right, between the theory and science of complexity and the practical side of it. And I'm coming from the land of practice, and I'm trained in nonlinear dynamics originally, but I spent my life working with organizations, public and private, I would say for governance and management. And I tried desperately to bridge these two views in my life, and I come to be a late bloomer doing my PhD in complexity theory at the University of Brussels, very highly interdisciplinary institute there. I will talk about two aspects of complexity systems theory that I'm occupied with. First of all, its practical relevance and the application in governance today. And second, I will talk about, is it possible to talk across realms of science? Because we all agree, I think, from listening to the speakers, that it does offer a language and some common ground to describe phenomena of today. For its practical relevance, in its pure form, and I think it was touched upon as well, it can be abstract, it can be technical, difficult to understand, and perhaps science should be left alone and not be implemented in practice, as Roland said. But I believe there are many practical circumstances where we could aim for understanding and management, not prediction and accuracy and control. We could utilize concepts from complex systems theory to serve as analogies and metaphors to navigate and manage and govern complexity. In my talk today, I'll talk about paradoxical experiences in organizations and how they emerge and how they may resolve. Utilizing metaphors and analogies does require some rigor in the ontology. How do we work across realms of science with social systems that are both people, competence, attitude, culture, with technology, assets, and all that comes to life? So we need to still be consistent across all these realms, and hence we need to describe the systems, I think, in a bit different way. From my practical work, I see three classes of problems that arise in organizations. First, what we can call the simple and normal problems that are complicated, not small, but they are classical and linear in a way where it can be broken down and solved by a project. Second, we have problems that comes in the form of balance and trade-offs. These are kind of the dynamic forces of an organization, and the balances could, for example, be freedom versus responsibility for employees. It could be exploration versus exploitation and such. Metaphorically speaking, again, these balances are attractors and equilibriums found for the system in a specific context. This is a dialectic process where you need to find and swing into a stable state for the organization. Third, we have the paradox, and these are the nasty ones. A paradox is something that is true and false at the same time, where there is no balance or equilibrium, and where the organization experiences contradictory worldviews. Let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. One example could be the paradox of control. So the more control we apply, the less control we get. We see this happening in governance of very complex systems such as research, healthcare, innovation. Other examples, just to give you a few, could be a situation where two management groups after the process of emerging organizations, where there's a paradox of trust and no trust at the same time in each other and in a common future. And if you've been in these situations, you can feel it in the room. It could be of building teams of individuals, of experts, for example, cross-discipline cooperation. So the only way you can cooperate is by not being an expert and being an expert at the same time. It's very difficult. It could be in politics where the democratic decision process is leading to a situation where no decisions are made, as we see in Washington and in Europe today. And it leads to these absurd situations. I mean, Belgium didn't have a government for 1.5 years, and everything worked just fine. So people start to lose faith. They become apathetic and observers to their own world. My initial hypothesis was that these paradoxes are not really paradox, it's a consequence of a system facing a more complex environment. But I needed to understand more about how and why. Okay, I know there's something called Fool's Rush in where angels fear to thread, so I'm gonna do just that. I'm gonna run a practical example in parallel. This is probably very dangerous in a scientific context like this, but I will do it anyway. And it's not from government, it's from private organization, but it's a very large organization where the control paradox played the main character. It's about an organization where they're trying to produce these babies, and it's big oil-producing ships. Each project is about $1 to $2 billion. It's immensely complex, not just because of technology, but the whole spread of suppliers and manufacturers and capital and technology and competence and just labor across the world. And it's highly dynamic, highly changing, and a very complex system or challenge topology to work with in the environment. This organization could take on one or two of these projects. Once it tried to make a third or a fourth one, it would fail dramatically. But coming back to the paradox, is there a phenomenon that really exists as an ontological unit that we can study? I researched the logical paradoxes and accepted that in the discipline of logic, this is possible to study. However, by definition, paradox is something that is true and false at the same time. In logic, we don't really have any time. They eliminated it. So, and time is at the core of all real-life systems. I looked in social sciences, however, few have described its dynamic ontological nature, more classifying it into types of problems. So I returned to nature science and the history of science, where I knew from my graduate training in math and physics that there was a core of development for science in general, the history of science. And they're quite clearly defined and articulated, and circumstances well documented. So I'll give you a few examples of these types of paradoxes and some of the findings, just to bring out some more general view on this. The first one I called God, Numbers, and Murder. And it dates back to 500 years before Christ. Hippasos was a follower of Pythagoras, and Pythagoras was a religious figure where they believed that God was found in the harmony of rational numbers and ratios on rational numbers. And they saw this in art, in building structures, in music, and I guess Hippasos, he had a normal day at work trying to solve geometry when he proved the incommensurable of between the diagonal and the sides of a square. And it doesn't sound so crazy, but it was enough to get him killed. In essence, he used the divine power of God, the numbers, to show that God does not exist. And for this, Hippasos was expelled from the Pythagoreans. He died at sea, pushed by the followers of Pythagoras. When I studied these historical cases, I found some commonalities in what happened. First, we have something called a postulate of impotence, an expression originally conceived by Sir Edmund Whittaker. I think it's a bit daring, so I wouldn't put it forward. But Hippasos was a pioneer of such postulate of impotence that uncovered a postulate paradox for the Pythagoreans. My second finding in these cases was that there was a process of generalization that followed. For this paradox, it took almost 2,000 years or so to complete this process with the invention of irrational numbers. But nothing in the real world has changed. Our paradox emerged because we tried to solve more complex problems with the categories that we already had in the system. It was resolved by increased complexity of our own categories to interpret the world. One last aspect of the Pythagorean example is that the invention of irrational numbers built to the axiomatic basis for irrational numbers, or it built on the irrational numbers, built on the rational numbers. Hence, it preserves existing theory, and I found this to be true for all the paradoxes I studied, the necessity for a generalization to adhere to the principle of permanence in the transition from one level to the next. The second and the last example that I present is from the beginning of the 19th century, where Newton's world ruled. Laplace stated his famous words that the world could be seen as a machine and time was reversible. At the same time, a very practical man, Joseph Fourier, wanted to know why heat traveled from hot to a cold object and not the other way around. This was common knowledge, so there's nothing new in it, but it would challenge and contradict the reversibility of time in the current worldview. And he was hence responsible for another postulate of impotence, merely by observing where he plainly stated that it was impossible to explain heat transfer using Newtonian dynamics. This led to a generalization process that we now found as thermodynamics, and later to the understanding that time is irreversible. In parallel, though, Ludwig Boltzmann was taking a different approach through the thought experiments. So he wasn't observing, he was thinking. He was developing a theory for thermodynamics based on Newton. So he described the behaviors of the molecules. However, his generalization was to introduce uncertainty and probability, where Newtonian view was only a special case of the overall complexity. Okay, so again, we find the principle of permanence binding the existing categories from Newton to the new categories of the generalized worldview. Finally, the two different epistemic frameworks represented the possibility for complementarity, coexisting to explain the same phenomenon. I found this to be a condition valid for several of the other paradoxes that I studied. Okay, so to sum up, I'm only giving you a couple of examples, there's plenty more. But summarize was that the social systems, i.e. we, code and classify impulses from the environment into categories and models of the world. And we know this from several other sciences as well. The model will be a reduced version of the complexity of the environment. And then we use these categories that we create to create distinctions which create the boundaries of the system, but the distinctions are dualities in nature, by nature. So if you say something is red, there's something that is not red. Further, it became clear that there's a process in the resolving of these paradoxes, and actually in the becoming of them. First, the postulate of impotence, saying something is impossible, and that usually brings the paradox alive. Then there's a generalization process where you introduce new categories for the system to understand its environment and its new complexity. This process needs to adhere to at least one principle, that was the principle of permanence, which is taking into account the previous categories that was already in the system, and had a possibility for complementarity on different levels. Okay, let me step into the practical example again of this big oil company. Of course, when we started, it didn't come shrink-wrapped in a form of a paradox. It never does. It's just frustration. These are camouflaged in other types of symptoms in order to deceive you in a way. But management had seen that the complexity increased with the number of projects being run in parallel. It was a type of lack of resilience. Also feeling the interconnectedness of the world and the speed of the requirements from the environment, and further that the new initiative to gain control was having marginal effect, leading to a belief that it was a cultural problem with attitude in the organization and increased bureaucracy significantly. The initial challenge lay with the top management to accept that the complexity of running several projects in parallel were too high for the corporate and project control, and that by applying more control, they were actually getting less control, and that the only way to gain control was to give up control. And here was a paradox and the postulate of impotence in this situation. The hypothesis came to be that the paradox emerged as the system confronts new areas of increased complexity with the categories already in use to understand existing environments. I now wanted to translate this into an organizational context and to utilize complex systems theory to investigate the phenomenon further. So in an organizational setting, this would mean that the organization was facing challenges with increased complexity from the environment. We could call this the challenge topology of the environment. The paradox emerged as the organization is confronting this challenge topology with an insufficient complexity of its internal categories and structures. However, I needed a conceptual model for a social system that would describe these categories and structures. This model would also have to be ontologically consistent, both vertically across levels from the individual to the organization, and across realms from the physical to the non-physical areas of life. And I was pretty determined that I didn't want to use mathematics, so I'll try to come back. It's not an ideological decision, but I wanted to see, is it possible to make conceptual models that are ontologically consistent and based on definitions valid, but without using agent-based modeling. I needed to describe the organization on 3 levels, from the individual level to what we can call the category or group level, to an organizational level. The group level, I think, was the most challenging, as it integrates people with actions, competence, and attitude on one hand, with the physical realm of, for example, technology and assets. It's on this intermediate level where actions and knowledge are integrated to form organizational categories and capabilities. It is also on this intermediate level where we structurally find the potential modularity and the possibility to increase the complexity of its governance. I wanted to ground it in a governance theory on social systems, and I found the concept of dynamic capability was extensively studied in organizational theory and strategic management. It's built, well, I'm gonna skip this because of time, but it's basically stating how the building blocks of an organization will be dynamic capabilities that are patterns of activities that are stable over time. And it also has the ability to recreate itself, i.e. what we would call emergence in systems theory. So it's fully in line with that. So I'll use the label dynamic capabilities as sort of that building block in a 3-layer model between the individual and the organization that should be isomorphic in form to go from the individual level to the organizational level. So in general, maybe it's hard to see at the bottom, but the conceptual model would see an organization as a system that is exposed to challenges from the environment that it can recognize, and through stable patterns of reactions between agents produce an output. This is a description on all levels for an individual in the world, for what we can call the dynamic capabilities, which is the building blocks of an organization and of the entire organization. But it's based on one major decision, and this is going back in philosophy, in history, and it's based entirely on an ontology of process and activity, not of substance. And hence it's a pure action ontology. I would go on to utilize a general reaction-based theory where everything in the organization is seen as reactions. This is a formal theory based in logic in a way, and it builds from chemistry, called chemical organizational theory. It sounds really weird. But if you, in John Holland's latest book on signals and boundaries that were recommended earlier, he gives a good introduction to chemical organization. I will not have time to go into it, but it's a formal way of describing organizations and proving its stability and its metasystems transitions without using the mathematical, in a sense, numerical agent-based modeling. I will, however, briefly touch upon 4 possible classes of reactions developed to describe this organization. First of all, it's the recognition. How do you recognize something from the environment? It's where the distinctions are made, and the distinctions are made based on the categories in the system. And these distinctions are really the ability of the agents in the system to react with the challenges from the environment. So are the agents in the system able to react with them? And that's not obvious. There's plenty of light in here, specters that we cannot see. Microsoft did not see the design of a computer as a competitive advantage in the computer industry. In fact, that's a paradox in itself. Apple wanted to make a computer that didn't look like a computer. That's why you had the iMacs with all the colors and it looked like a briefcase. So that was the first class of reactions that needed to be found. The second one is just simply simple reactions. I won't go into details, but on a social level, it could be the reaction between two actors, where one poses a question and the other has some competence, and it creates more competence. I know it's a very conceptual way to write it, but I'm just trying to illustrate how you can use reaction language to actually describe these types of relations that are not assigned to any type of realm of physical or non-physical science. Third, we have what we can call the categories. These are set of the stable reaction patterns that start to form and exist over time. In the alignment of the concept of dynamic capabilities, a building block of an organization again, these are stable sets. I call them categories in this model. It's also in line with the general reaction-based theory. Formally, we would say that these topologies or sets of reactions are closed and self-maintained, and hence prove to be stable organizations from a formal point of view. From the same theory, we can prove that these conditions for stability corresponds to the attractors and the equilibriums for the system. In general model, I've labeled these patterns categories, as I said. Fourth, we can envision that the stable patterns that we call categories are themselves some type of superagents starting to react with each other in similar fashion. We see this in biology with cells that are stable patterns of molecular reactions, but also in social organizations where, for example, a design capability starts to react with an engineering capability to create something like this, the iPhone. Hence, we may experience a metasystem transition and the emergence of new qualitative features, but features that also governs the level below. Again, the Apple design now governs every Apple product and every Apple individual employed at Apple. So again, to summarize, this is a model for the organization that can be described as a reaction-based system of dynamic capabilities. It's a description for the dynamic capability that may itself be a reaction-based system of individuals and technology, and it's also applicable to the individual for the biological and psychological systems in an individual. Okay, I'm going to step back into the practical world again with the company corporate example. As I described earlier, the challenges from the environment was increasingly complex and interdependent. So we know that this would require increased internal complexity as a requisite of variety in the company. From my experience, it's very difficult and radical to think outside of traditional structures and hierarchies for most senior managers in any organization, that'd be public or private. And I think we have to learn to live with that. I think we need to meet them. It's not about convincing them that complexity science is the right thing. It's about starting a dialogue with them and to understand where they are. So it's not about being right, it's about uncovering common grounds. I think we also have to learn to live with the fact that the required topology of capabilities inside the organization cannot be aligned with the traditional structures or hierarchies over time. It's just not going to be possible to meet or to be fit in that fitness landscape. It will have to change, and it will have to be distributed in networks and virtual spaces, and definitely not purely based on the laws of geography. This is why this is also why today the increased dynamics of the environment, why the predominant nature of these companies are organized around projects, to rapidly reshuffle, refocus, and relocate competence to match the external challenges. However, the increased number of parallel projects, as in this example, remember when they reach a number of 2 projects, it would break down, required an even more complex structure, because you would do plenty of these in parallel, and it required not only a complexity in the project, but as a stable interaction between parts of the project on the organizational level. Also, the interaction between parts of the project and the base organization. So 2 problems would arise. First, the internal topology. Now, the internal complexity of the projects was too high to achieve the modularity and flexibility needed. Second, the main problem in most project-based organizations is the transfer and recirculation of experience from one project to the next. The experience is aggregated, however, on an individual level, and it's not efficiently aggregated on the organizational level. In other words, the dynamic capabilities are not stable over time on an organizational level, and on the organizational level, again, it loses the fitness to solve its function. As part of the generalization process stemming from the paradox of control, the management had to rethink its entire foundation for how the organization was governed. The structure needed to be modularized with a minimal number of interfaces to reduce overall complexity. New categories required for organizational units were established based on the dynamic capabilities. And they don't call them that because when it's impossible to talk to people in management about the things that we talk about in this room, as it is, I assume, impossible to come back to you guys and talk about management because these are divided by the river. But I'm here trying to do it anyway. But these stable patterns needed to be integrated in cross-functional teams. The teams create niches in the systems perspective with recirculation of experience and tacit knowledge. It's almost like Douglas' reference to niches of elderly and young people in the same room. Okay. Okay, very quickly. So the stability of the system is given by a certain challenge topology in the environment, and with changes in the environment, there will be comes a deviation of the stable equilibrium. We may say that the system's internal representation of categories does not completely match the external reality. Metaphorically speaking, we may see this as the type of interpretation function of the system in its environment. It indicates a system's ability to recognize and react with challenges based on its own categories. A physical system cannot always change its own internal topology. However, a social system does have the potential to do so. Okay, so for those of you very quickly familiar with complex systems, you may represent this in a state phase plane. For those of you who aren't, it's pretty intuitive. These are a few of the archetypes of trajectories around the stable attractor. First, a simple deviation, then a spiral, and thirdly, a limit cycle. And it's time to come back to the three original problems in organizations introduced at the beginning: the normal problem, the dialectic problem, and not to forget the paradox. I'm not going to go in and try to explain it. I think it's quite intuitive, and you can see from the slides here. This indicates that a paradox in a social system is really a limit cycle in the system. And I found in the historical cases a situation that was created by the epistemology, as the system is now creating the limit cycle as a function of its interpretation function and the change in the interpretation function. It's not an ontological unit. If it were, the system would need to be in two states, true and false at the same time. And this is impossible, breaking all space-time continuum and the laws of governing dynamic systems. A general way to escape the limit cycle is to introduce a new degree of freedom that will change the dynamics around the attractor. This corresponds to the postulate of impotence in the historical cases. By articulating the actual paradox, one opens a new dimension and degree of freedom. It could also come from changing the way the system interprets and reacts with its environment by introducing new categories. This corresponds to the generalization process found in the historical cases. Third way to escape the limit cycle is to change the structure of the system, to create a new stable sets of reactions made possible by the physical structure, as for the modular design in the practical example. Fourth would be to change the reaction pattern among the actors through changes in the state of the individual actor. One could initiate new patterns or reactions, which again could emerge as new categories. This corresponds with the possibility for complementarity found in the historical cases, but also the individual actors' epistemic framework may be different but contribute to the same generalized understanding. This is a degree of freedom especially important for social systems where process-based development goes hand in hand with the structural changes. Finally, one observation that is a bit more speculative, but I find it fascinating, is if one studies the nature of limit cycle, there's always an energy source fueling the circular behavior. In classical linear representation, this is a parameter linked to the second derivative of the state variable, that it would be here, the change in the change of the system's ability to interpret its environment. Metaphorically speaking, again, this could be linked to the ability of the change in the organization, in other words, to the more attitude or culture. Okay, I see I'm running out of time, but to conclude, these are just the categories developed. I think this was probably summing up 3 sentences of what happened in this practical example. To avoid the paradox, you needed to maximize the complexity on the organizational level to match the challenge topology in its environment and the complexity of it. The way to do it was to minimize the complexity between the dynamic capabilities, i.e. create a new structure of teams with as least number of links as possible, again, by maximizing the complexity inside the dynamic capabilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, questions, please.
Hi, I'm Siwan from NTU. Actually, this is more like a comment rather than a question. And if you substitute some of the words in your slides, actually, you're also talking about the brain. Because I don't know whether you realize that, because again, you know, the brain has evolved in such a way that it minimizes contact with the environment. There's an internal circuitry that does its own stuff. So pretty much like what you've drawn down here. And of course, we know what the brain is for. And I think pretty much that's what complex adaptive organizations are also doing. And that is to process environmental information, do useful work with it.
This is very consciously thought of that way, exact way, because I wanted to have the ability to describe some of these phenomena on the individual level, i.e. the brain. How do people perceive the world and how are categories formed in people's reality? With the dynamic capability of a small group that also codes and creates a reality in it. And on the organizational level, that is an equally complex system of these dynamic capabilities.
So in a sense, let's follow up with I think we understand quite a bit about how the brain learns. So maybe we can explore that and see how those kind of understanding can be applied to modern management theory as to how to actually retain organizational knowledge. Because you say that the individuals themselves, they've learned quite a lot through different exposures to different problems, but the organization on the whole doesn't learn that much. But of course, we know that the brain has a holographic way of encoding information. It's very good at doing so. So maybe we can transfer some of the insights that they derive from studying the brain into organizational development.
Yes, and I do believe that's true, but that's also, you know, when I said the projects were getting way too large to actually handle the complexity, it's the same for the brain. You don't store these moving glasses one place in the brain, right? So it's modularized, it's stored different places and recombined. And I think that's exactly the insight. But in order to go from the brain description to the organizational level, you have to go across ontologically level of aggregation, but also different scientific disciplines. So that's why I was so keen to develop this action ontology based on the reaction-based language, where I didn't have to fight the biologist on one side and the psychologist on one side, and I didn't have to try to mathematically model the equality between the brain cell and an individual at work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next. Yeah, take one. Yeah, stand there. Yes. Okay. Then you and then you.
In the beginning, you talk about the whole concept of time and the linearity of time. What I miss in this, but it may simply be because I'm not familiar with your language and your organizational approach, is the actual differences in temporality of the rhythms of the various feedbacks and how those impact on the end result, and in particular in the practical conception of your tankers or whatever they are. I think part of the difficulty for the management of having the added complexity is actually having more interactive timescales that create more, a different kind of complexity, let me put it that way, that they can't handle. Is that right? Can you comment on that, or did I misunderstand things?
I hope I understand your question, but I'll try to answer it. No, I don't think I understand your question, to be honest.
Simply, look, you create an added layer of complexity. That basically means that in the information processing, there's going to be more timescales involved that interact with each other in various ways.
Yes.
And it seems to me that therefore, to really understand a system like this, the temporal element and the different timescales is fundamental.
Well, I think if you look at the example here, what we're trying to do is really to reduce complexity first.
Yeah.
So on the, that's why I come back to the levels again. Again, hoping I understand your question. But on the organizational level, in the environment of the organization, we need to maximize complexity or increase the complexity to meet the challenges in the environment. Inside the organization, we need to reduce the complexity because projects were getting too big. Hence the modularization, you have to break it down differently. Then when you have the modules again, inside that I call dynamic capabilities, inside these dynamic capabilities, you wanted to increase the complexity as much as possible because you wanted to recirculate competence across different disciplines that were previously separated. I don't know if I now answered your question.
We'll pick this up later on.
Okay.
Thank you.
During dinner, always good for a dinner. And you had a question.
Okay. I'm working?
Yeah, it's functional.
I hear you.
Okay. So you were mentioning that in many cases, the more control you have, the less control you get.
Yes.
This reminds me of another argument by those who believe in the free market. They were saying that, well, just leave the things to the free market, and the government basically stand outside. I'm just wondering whether your model can provide any support or counter arguments to, the belief of those free market believers.
I think it depends on the question you're asking, because it's not you're asking, but we are asking. If we say that the free market is bringing prosperity and is destroying the world, then that's sort of a paradox in itself. Now, I think this framework that I put forward could bring some clarity to that question. If the question is, does the free market work well to produce economic output? I'm not sure, because then you're still working within the same system that I was meant to optimize.
Okay. Yes.
So I have actually a question and a remark. Comment, I don't know. So the question would be that this morning actually we learned that if you have a few parameters, you can probably distill 100 theories from that. So what you did is actually you distilled a theory. And now my question is this the theory we have to look for? Because you came up with an ontological description of the different processes, but normally what you do is you build an ontology on things that you can actually measure, that you can identify. And so making an ontology of a brain, we know almost how to do that, because we got lots of data on that and lots of information on that. So we can actually make that abstraction and build an ontology. And once we have built that ontology, we can actually put it on the stress and see whether it really does what we think it should do. And that way we can do science and discover that the theory that we came up with really explains what we're looking for.
Right.
So my question would be, and then after that I have a short remark. My question would be, how sure are you that this theory, this ontology, which seems to be floating in my feeling, is really doing what it should do? And the remark I have is, I strongly object with one remark you made. You said, in your paradoxes, you cannot study your paradoxes because logic eliminated time. Well, that's absolutely not true. As far as I know, there is this thing that's called logic predicative, temporal predicative logic, which is actually doing these kind of things. So why not use that, I would say.
First the question.
Fair enough. The comment on logic, fair enough. It's just that it's a pretty heavy discussion to enter. I think also here we're in two landscapes. One is a scientific versus a practical landscape, and then there is a landscape between the traditional sciences. So any social science would be self-referential and also ontologically, in a way, self-referential. Nature science would be deterministic, even though more precise in the testing of the hypothesis, etc. I think that this is, I understand your concern, and I'm concerned about it myself. I am testing this hypothesis on two parallel companies in the way. Does it prove to be scientifically rigor? No. And what I said in my introduction was also that I'm trying to apply metaphors, analogies, and concepts to understand and navigate. I'm not trying to prove that this is exactly how an organization works.
So what I'm trying to understand is ontologies are an abstraction of something which is way more complex and we cannot reason about. That's when we have an ontology that we can start to reason about. But it's built on something. So my question is, what is this? What is your ontology built on then?
It's built on as I said, a pure action ontology and process philosophy. If that's what you mean, it goes all the way back to whether reality is substance or process. And it goes on from there to build up a model based on a pure action ontology and thereafter a reaction theory on it. But I might be misunderstanding what you're saying.
Okay. But now the objection.
No, I agree with it.
So
But I would still say that it's a collapse of epistemology and ontology and logics.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
that was all, yeah.
You had a question? Yes. Please.
Maybe just a brief comment or observation that cuts more links us the whole day's discussion in a way. Because it seems to me in a lot of the different contributions in the discussions, we've touched on a lot of aspects of complexity. Yet one of the things we haven't really explored is this question of governance and what actually the implications for processes, structures of governance are. It seems to me that in a lot of the contributions, there have been explicit or implicit challenges to some of the dominant ways of governing, either as you say in the corporate context, in the organizational context, or this morning in the context of how we govern public goods or other aspects that relate to sustainability. But sort of the practical implications for how we organize societies, how our basic modernization paradigms of how do we organize states and productive processes in societies. I think that would be the logical next step to discuss in this once we want to link this and move towards a research agenda, linking it to the practical questions of governance. So, are there sort of your 2 or 3 takeaways from that for this question of governance process, or maybe that's a wider question for the room? Yeah.
Let's try something. Give it a shot.
Well, if I were to say something on a remark would be, first, learn to live and breathe the practical world. Don't come in and ask questions and persuade them that they haven't understood anything, because they live in this complexity. They live in the complexity. Everybody understands it. It's intuitive. You have to use a metaphor of dance, not war. So it's not about being right, it's about being believed. So we need to understand how they think about it, and I think it's more about how do we get the traction with them, because I think there is interest. But if we come in as scientists to say, listen guys, you don't understand anything, and it's so difficult to me to explain the complexity theory to you, so I can't really do it because you're so stupid, you can't understand it. You're not going to get the attention. So, and I think that's part of probably not coming through in this, but part of working with these types of things is more about dialogue than discussions. It's not about being right. It's
Is
about
it-
being believed.
Is it, and you're a consultant.
Yeah, partly.
Yeah, and so is it possible to add something to what Stephen is saying? Quite often, consultants can say they have a set of do's and do nots, and so is it possible to come up to your clients with a set of do's and do nots derived from complexity theory? So saying, listen, I'm in the complexity business, and I'm coming to your business, to your company, and you have a problem with the environment and so on, and you want to have change. Well, let me say to you, there are 5 do's and 5 do nots, which I'm deriving from complexity theory, and I'm giving them you for free. And then we'll make a contract after that. Say something like that.
Right.
Just to impress the other one and saying, listen, this I can't say to you on beforehand. These 5 you never should do, and these 5 you should do.
But if I was to say 5 do's and don'ts, I would be living and believing there was a complexity, right? Because if it was 5 do's and don'ts, it wouldn't be a complex system we're trying to solve. So the only thing that I could say, which is again to generalize the categories, is what we'll say earlier, we have to shift the paradigm on the human placement in this world.
Yeah.
So if we believe that organizations act as machines or robots or rational individuals, we fail miserable. But I think there is no 5 takeaways, but I think it's possible.
This is a kind of a do or do not.
It is, but on a very, very general level.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We are going to stop now. Okay. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
And